the question that I have in your response to Mr. Rodriguez. But I'd like to go to the rental assistance programs. And I was very pleased by the fact that the President's budget substantially increases HUD's core rental assistance program. However, as you well know, that really much more is needed. If you look at the current situation, particularly given this economic crisis that we're in, on any a night, for example, in Los Angeles, there are 28,000 people, or 70% of the city's homeless population, have no options whatsoever for shelter, or on any given night, the waiting list for housing choice vouchers in Los Angeles is, right now it is currently closed because of the excess in demand. Now, my question is, given the limitations we have in terms of the monies, what other things can HUD do, can the committee do to meet the housing needs of these very vulnerable populations beyond, the HUD's, the rental assistance programs? And I know that there was some discussion in your investing in people in places with regards to streamlining the department's rental assistance programs. And if you could just elaborate a little bit about that.
Well, I think particularly for you, Congresswoman, given that you're on the Labor HHS Subcommittee, one of the most important things that we can do that I think has been one of the great lessons that we've learned over the last decade or so in the progress we've made with the chronically homeless is that unless we can begin to connect folks who are chronically homeless, not just with housing, but with also with the broader service funding that they need. For example, a large share of the chronically homeless have a range of disabilities. And unless we can get them, whether it's Medicaid or other services that they need to really deal with those problems long term, it's going to be hard to keep their housing stable and get their lives back on track, frankly. And so one of the things that we've proposed, I've been working very closely with Secretary Sebelius and her team around how do we connect our vouchers in particular to the mainstream sources of benefits that they have at HHS that can help to stabilize lives. And what we've proposed in the budget is 10,000 incremental vouchers. It's a relatively small number, but it would allow us to begin to connect more explicitly what we do with HHS's efforts. Just to be very specific, on the family side, we're proposing about 6,000 vouchers that would be competed to state agencies that are willing to connect their TANF funding and can also get schools in those communities connected as well. We now know, and Secretary Duncan has been very active on this, we have lots of early warning indicators in schools when we have a child who's at risk of homelessness or has fallen into homelessness, and yet we haven't been targeting those families even though we know that they're at risk of homelessness. As I said earlier, often much cheaper to catch them before they fall into homelessness than to let them fall in and then deal with the crisis that comes from that. And so we're targeting 6,000 vouchers toward a combination of state efforts that can target TANF money as well as school targeting efforts together. 4,000 vouchers that would work in a similar way for the chronically homeless connected with substance abuse and mental health resources from HHS. So those are early efforts, demonstrations, if you will, to see if we can make those connections work better and ultimately, frankly, save money. The best efforts around chronic homelessness have showed us that we can actually save overall resources from the taxpayer if we target these effectively, the people that are most at risk.
Okay, the President's budget proposes a reduction to the Public Housing Capital Fund. And again, I refer to Los Angeles, which alone faces $500 million in deferred maintenance. And around the country, public housing agencies face $20 to $30 billion in capital needs and this is even after the $4 billion infusion from the American Recovery and Investment Act. My question is that, given the need for capital improvements to public housing, and the fact that that addressing these needs would also create jobs at a time when they are so critically needed, is this really the right time to reduce the funding for these housing capital funds, since we could really get a double whammy on this?
So two things I would say on that. Again, as I've said a number of times, this was not a year of easy decisions in terms of the budget. Given the focus that we had on fully funding vouchers, project-based Section 8, which make up the vast majority of our budget, we had some very difficult choices to make. We had to reduce in other programs, and we chose a strategy of reducing some of the capital programs. We obviously believe that public housing preservation is incredibly important. It's why we supported so strongly the $4 billion that was in the Recovery Act. And I think even with these reductions, we will end up with public housing that's in substantially better condition than where we were a year ago before the Recovery Act. The only other thing I would say is that long term, if we are really going to deal with the challenges on the capital side facing public housing, we're going to need to leverage, as I said earlier, other forms of capital, both private capital as well as low-income housing tax credits and a range of other types of investments. And that's exactly what our TRA, Transforming Rental Assistance proposal, is doing. And in fact, as we move, we have proposed operating subsidies that would actually be somewhat higher for the units that would be moved over to Transforming Rental Assistance. What that would allow us to do is reduce the amount of capital spending from the Public Housing Capital Fund that would need to go to those units. Because if they're getting an operating stream that allows them to raise other capital, we would no longer need Public Housing Capital Fund money to go to those units. So over the long term, we believe that moving to a single operating subsidy that can take care of both operating and capital needs, that will be a more effective way to fund those units, will allow the kind of mixed income, mixed use developments that I talked about earlier, as well as alleviate the need for the Public Housing Capital Fund in the long run.
Okay, thank you.